Is there an underlying purpose behind the existence of multiple disciplines? Why do we specialize nowadays? It was not uncommon or out of the ordinary to find, amongst history's numerous intellectual figures, numerous polymaths, thinkers that specialize in a dozen areas. Leibniz was a mathematician, philosopher, inventor, geologist, theologian, logician, mystic, and linguist. René Descartes' works spanned philosophy, mathematics, ethics, cosmology, and what we call today psychology. And of course, we need not mention Aristotle and Plato. From today's perspective, this wide range of specialization, polymathism, is certainly an exception, and usually occurs in people we deem exceptional. The departmentalization and division between disciplines that, traditionally, and to someone like Plato constituted an indivisible monolith, is something that is unique, to say the least, to the postmodern and industrial world. Some scholars like Toynbee would consider it a corollary feature of the industrial system. And on the timescale, there is indeed a relationship of correspondence between the inception and evolution of the industrial system and the anatomical structure of the education system, particularly the emergence of independent departments like physics, chemistry, history, geology, maths, etc., studied in total isolation. George Steiner, author of After Babel, thought that industry went as far as affecting speech habits of men and women. Historian of ideas Arthur Lovejoy expressed that any understanding, even of a few great writers, is impossible without some acquaintance with the general background and values of that age, which can only be done through a historical inquiry into the nature and interrelation of the common ideas of that age. A statement implying that an idea can only make sense when considered as part of a whole, as helping to paint an overall picture, as a proverbial piece of the large puzzle. Aristotle codified many phenomena and problems, produced works discussing everything from cosmology to ethics, never limiting himself to one subject or discipline like the sophists, with whom he contrasted the classical philosopher in the last video. He did so in the belief that reality is one complex whole, a great chain of being, in which not one part or knot is comprehensible without its role in the whole. And without this universal view in mind, it would not have been possible for him to codify said phenomena, and the area of logic would have had to wait a little while longer. This idea rests on the seemingly innate assumption that we live in a well-packaged system. The universe is rational because it is orderly and well-packaged. The parts of which our idea of the universe is composed bear a relation, and this relation is our idea of the universe logically demonstrated. And polymathism, we can say, is an attempt at approximating that universal vision, of trying to expand the polymath's radius of consciousness. Gestalt psychology embodies this idea, a method that looks at the human mind and behavior as a whole. This holistic approach or worldview sees no discontinuation between different ideas. All divisive lines are illusory and artificial, because the universe is a necessary continuum. Hence the maxim, nature abhors a vacuum. Aristotle's law of continuity that we find in his zoology work. It is a worldview that sees only the so-called silver lining, with which nature was supposedly sewn together. This approach is reared by the demonstrable fact that pattern is what evokes cognition. Demonstrable because we see this in language. The grammar comprises a series of words linked together in such a way as to give us meaning. The grammar or syntax is simply the vehicle. As linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf wrote, pattern of a simple structure that guides words is more important than the words. The holistic or gestalt approach is patterned precisely after that Aristotelian scheme. As Aristotle is all about wisdom and the pursuit thereof, wrote in the Metaphysics, the wise man knows everything in the appropriate way, and wisdom, according to him, is to do with knowledge of causes and principles, and that, he thought, is what distinguishes and makes the designer, for instance, wiser than the artisan, and why the ability to teach falls upon the wise, whom, to consummate our language analogy, shares the same sort of relationship to a student as does a sentence to the words contained therein, a guide. In his response to John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, Leibniz weighs in on the same idea by distinguishing between the concepts of perception and apperception, saying that at any given time there is an infinity of perceptions within us, but without apperception, we can't be conscious of them. This is also the same scheme personified in the idea of cosmopolitanism. As esteemed historians like Arnold J. Toynbee said, it is impossible to study the history of, say, France without also studying those of England, Italy, Germany, and so forth, because France, from a historical standpoint, is only a parochial member of the larger society to which those other countries of Western Europe also belong, Western Rome, a part of a once unified Rome, further implying that one must study the history of Europe to understand that of her individual composite pieces. And France or England aren't intelligible fields of study. The intelligible ones are those that have a greater extension in both time and space than a national state or city-state. The national state in this paradigm is no more than an inseparable part of an indivisible whole, or an articulation of the true social entities, not independent entities in themselves. Einstein expresses this idea by saying that no great discovery was ever made in science except by one who lifted his nose above the grindstone of details and ventured on a more comprehensive vision. The, as it were, intellectual cosmopolitan in turn lifts his nose above the details and myopia of his current state and sees, with his weary eyes, a universal pattern or scheme, a world divided along artificial lines, whether intellectual in the form of individualized, independent departments, or on the societal level, with the division of labor and the worker being atomized, singled out and limited to his role, or on the international scale with once large, powerful, and self-dependent blocks becoming small, weak, dependent states, governed by the overriding principle of interdependence, rather than the classical war. The cosmopolitan sees that each level emulates almost exactly and is reproduced according to the conditions of the one below it, allowing him to see the causal link and diagnose the problem. That without an atomized member of society, there can be no atomized state, and without the advent of departments, said members of society could not specialize and therefore become atomized. He thus concludes that the world is the way it is, not spontaneously as a result of circumstances outside of man's control, but necessarily so as following up from elaborate policies weaved together for the purpose of giving the world its current look. That the architects of the modern world, whom, besides being cosmopolitans themselves, or the designers as opposed to the artisans in Aristotle's analogy, understood the general historical tendency and impulse that indwells the consciousness of the individual or individual society, of aspiring to become universals in themselves. And the architects, ignoring the unsavory details of their operation, managed to satiate that tendency and impulse through the model, albeit unstable, of the nation-state as a member of a globalized society.